My name is Mark Stephen. I'm going to be chairing today's event, which is the 8th Annual Digital Transformation Summit. I have to say very briefly, thank you very much to all our conference exhibitors and sponsors who are here today, without whom these conferences simply wouldn't be possible. We've got a great range of solution providers in the exhibition area upstairs. Pay them back if you can by going and saying hello and seeing what they're up to. Make the most of your time here today if you can. However difficult it is, go up and to a perfect stranger and say hello. You never know what it might lead to. Engage with your peers, build new connections, get involved in the sessions and questions and answers, etc. And if you are actually going onto social media and sharing some of the information from today, can you use the hashtag #DT Summit, all one word. Briefly, our next event's a Digit Expo, which is at the EICC. That's on the 10th of November. That's a biggie. That's the biggest thing that Digit do. There's over 1,200 people involved in that. And then on the 23rd of February next year, and where the hell did this year go? 23rd of February next year in Dynamic Earth here, that's ITSX. It's a new event looking at the future of customer service and IT support. And details on how to book can be found on the Digit website, which is www.digitfyi. Right, that's enough from me. Let's get straight into our speakers now. Our first speaker is Graham Johnston, who's Chief Executive Officer, Retail and Distribution at the Donaldson Group. And interestingly, given the sort of subject matter of this conference, what Graham wants to talk about is the importance of actually being human. So, Graham, over to you.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Good. Normally, I don't like going first, but given the credentials of the others and my colleagues on the panel, I'm glad I'm not having to follow them. I have to apologise in advance. Lack of sleep and far too much caffeine this morning may encourage me to talk very quickly. So if I'm talking too quick, just chuck something at me or wave or something. Give me a sign and I'll try and slow down. So first of all, probably start just a bit of an overview of the Donaldson Group. I joined the Donaldson Group literally 5 weeks ago, so I'm not here to talk about the Donaldson Group generally today, but I thought I'd give you an introduction to who we are and what we do. So it's a family business, 162 years old, a timber business, and it's made up of 17 individual businesses underpinned by 5 core values that basically drive us in everything that we do. You may recognise some of these brands that make up the group. Recently been put into 3 separate divisions. The Offsite, which focuses on timber frame, roof, floor, door, stair manufacturing. The Interiors, which is kitchens and interior products. And then Retail and Distribution, which is the area of the business that I look after, which is made up of these businesses. MGM Timber, Timber Merchants. You may have seen them scattered across the UK. We've got 14 branches. Insulation business that provides insulation to the trade. New Style Products, innovative factory up in Aberdeen that produces supply of high quality products for the building trade. Perform Panel, which is today's alternative to tiles, so a business that provides wet room panels. Timber Cut for You, so if anyone's looking to make something out of timber and you want high quality timber cut to a particular size, Timber Cut for You is an e-commerce site that enables you to put in your size and your type of timber and get it sent straight to you. And then Plain and Simple, which is a innovative online marketplace for merchants across the UK, and something that is a growing trend in the UK with marketplaces, and great to have all of these businesses within my division. But that's pretty much the extent of what I'm going to talk about the Donaldson Group today. My talk today is a little bit more about, as Mark said, about the human aspects of transformation. And this quote here about us needing to be more human in the age of digital, I'm kind of going to hopefully try and reposition this a little bit through what we talk about today, and reframe it, because ultimately, is it the age of digital, or should it really be the age of us as humans? I'm going to start by talking a little bit about 4 things that I've learnt from being in transformation projects, programs. I've worked within a few large organizations that have done fairly ambitious transformation programs. These are just my personal learnings from what I've taken from them. So bear with me a little bit. The first one's a little bit abstract. Who remembers the Transformer toys? You remember them, right? Okay, most of us remember them either because we had them or because our kids have them now. They still exist, right? I mean, they're still pretty big. But the Transformer toy goes from a car to a robot. Then what? It's pretty much it, right? It goes from a car to a robot, and then what next? I tend to try and think about the transformation programs more like Pokemon Go, which is, it's about looking at where to find, explore, but essentially nurture and evolve. So I think if we think about transformation programs more through the lens of how do you take an idea and an end state, work out how you want to nurture and evolve the technology that you have today, ultimately the end result ends up being a bit better. Bear with me on this analogy. The second thing that I learned is don't make it an exclusive VIP club. So many times when a transformation program starts off, you take your best people and move them into the transformation program. But it's all sound in terms of saying, okay, take your best people out of the business that's driving your business, that's operating your business, that understands every element of your business, and move them into the transformation program. But the value of these great people running your business is that they know everything about your business. They all know everything about the technology, the evolution of the technology. They're your best Pokemon trainers, if you like. They know where all the Pokemons are. They know how to evolve the different Pokemons into the next evolution. Taking them away from that day job into this ring-fenced VIP club can take them away from the day job. And actually, 2 or 3 months down the line, the business has moved on, and these people are still focused on the future rather than the current reality. So it's really important to make sure that when a transformation program is live, that it's a collaborative effort across all of the different teams that help driving forward the transformation program and driving forward the business. The third is thinking about hearts and minds rather than pounds and timelines. The phrase of we're going to fly the plane and change the engines at the same time is a phrase I've heard on a number of occasions in transformation programs. And I think it's meant to set the scene that this is not going to be easy and we still need to run the business and transform the business at the same time. Very sound. But actually, if you think about it, that's impossible. And actually, from a psychological perspective, you're starting at the transformation program at the very, very start thinking we're embarking on an impossible task here. So really making sure that the idea of the transformation program is all about gaining the hearts and minds of the colleagues within the business. Because if we start with a set of timelines and objectives that become unrealistic, then we lose the motivation. Those people that have come into the transformation program lose their motivation because ultimately what we're looking at is a timeline that is baked into future years' budgets. And then the pressure starts literally from day one. Now, I am fully aware that and cognizant of the fact that a transformation program does need to pay back. The timelines and the amount of money it costs to transform is very, very important. But it really is important that the hearts and minds lead the transformation program, and the pounds and timelines essentially are a result of that program. And then the fourth, and linked onto that, is focus on what it's going to enable. A lot of transformation programs think about what it's going to replace. So moving from 15 systems to 1, what is that actually going to enable? So having a clear set of outcomes that will be human-centered outcomes. What is it going to enable me to do as a colleague, as an employee? What's it going to enable the customer to do as a customer of that business? Should be the key aims of the transformation program. So focus on what it's going to enable rather than what it's going to replace. So I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about generally where we are, right? The world's not an equal place. And I'm going to read some stats here. I've written this down. I saw a really powerful infographic the other day, which talked about the fact of, imagining the world as 100 people. So if the world was a village with 100 people, 86 of those 100 people can read and write, but 14 can't. One person in that village controls 50% of the money. 87 people within the village have clean water, but 13 do not. 77 people in the village have shelter, but 23 do not. and 44 people in the village have access to the internet, but 56 don't. So when we talk about all these amazing technology transformation programs and all the innovations that we're embarking on across the world, we're doing it for an ever-decreasing number of people who can benefit from these technological advances. And actually the gap between those that have and those that have not is getting wider. And when we think back to the industrial revolutions that have passed, these are the 4 industrial revolutions that most people recognize. And I think it's widely sort of known that the first industrial revolution generally saw an increase of living standards for pretty much most people because of the innovation that came with the first industrial revolution. Living standards increased, life expectancy increased. But as the first industrial revolution reached the later stages, that started to change, and we saw the social impacts of the first industrial revolution really playing out. And those social impacts and the gap between the have and the have-nots have really grown throughout. And this 4th industrial revolution that we're in right now really does focus on digital innovation. And as I just mentioned before, the people that can access that benefit is reducing. So I read a paper recently which I found very, very inspiring, which suggests that actually the 4 industrial revolution approach needs to slightly change, and looking back retrospectively, maybe it's already started to change, but ultimately makes the case for industry 6.0. So it kind of talks through the fact that the first 3 were mechanism, electrification, automation, but 3.5 in the 80s saw the first sort of real rise of globalization. We then saw digitalization in the early 2000s. And actually in 2010, we saw the rise of personalized revolution in terms of people being able to use the technology to personalize experiences. But the thought here is that this industry 6.0 really probably started around the pandemic, should be the last industrial revolution per se, but puts humans at the very, very center. And the outcome being that really everything is focused on us, humans, reducing the gap, ridding the world of inequality and poverty for good. So that leads me to talk about something that's very close to my heart, and some of you may be been involved in some way, shape or form, which is the Tech for Good Alliance. Because I think taking on what we've just talked about and maybe the scene that's been set there, we've got an incredible opportunity to start Industry 6.0 through some key focused attention within our industry and supporting the third sector. So hands up if anyone's been involved with the Scottish Tech Army in any way, shape or form. A couple of people in the room. So the Scottish Tech Army, just as a quick headline, was started in April 2020 by 2 Scottish tech entrepreneurs, Alistair Forbes and Pete Jaco. And they saw the impact of the pandemic was having on the third sector, not-for-profit organisations, and wanted to do something to galvanise the tech talent in Scotland to support the third sector organisations through the pandemic. So as we stand in March 2022, the Scottish Tech Army has supported more than 300 not-for-profit organisations and had 2,000 volunteers give their time, their energy and their efforts to supporting these 300 organisations. It's been a massive success. But where we are right now is evolving the Scottish Tech Army into this Tech for Good Alliance. And this is about creating positive change by joining forces. So, we have got a real crisis on our hands when we're looking at the shortage of skills that can be used within the third sector environment. And by joining forces from businesses, volunteers, government, joining forces, we can effect positive change and support the lives of people that depend on the third sector organisations. And an interesting sort of infographic on this is around, what contributes to the economy. And it's a fairly simple model, but, the state, so the government, the market or businesses, and civil society all contribute to the performance of the economy. But we only hear about the state and the market. We only hear about government and businesses and the impact that they have on the economy, because there's some very, very readily available statistics and KPIs that measure the impact that these two have on the economy. So GDP, EBITDA, GMV, there's loads and loads of different measures that are used within state and market. But actually, there are millions of people who volunteer their time to civil society, which has a massive impact on the economy, but it's not measured effectively. So we don't really see how much, or we don't measure as well as we do the state and the market, the impact that it has. So this is where the opportunity comes. So Tech for Good in the UK, there is a great movement already started in the UK around Tech for Good. But as you can see from this slide, the amount of businesses involved in Tech for Good in the UK is very, very small. It's about 0.5% of businesses that have a tech function or are tech businesses are involved in Tech for Good within the UK. 50% of these businesses employ less than 10 people. So you can see that actually the opportunity here for businesses that have a tech function, that businesses that are tech businesses to contribute to Tech for Good in the UK is massive. Just by doubling that, you know, we basically we have a company the size of 30,000 people if we do that. Massive, massive opportunity. Now, there's some big names that are involved in Tech for Good globally. JP Morgan, you can see there since 2011, they've had 4,900 of their employees engaged and have impacted estimated plus 1 million lives by the activity. They have a full team of colleagues that spend their entire time working on Tech for Good. So they've gone, you know, kind of full on in terms of their contribution. And you can see Microsoft, IBM, and Salesforce. Salesforce famously, since they started, dedicate 1% of their technology and 1% of their time to Tech for Good operations. So, you know, fantastic opportunities for businesses like that. So what is the Tech for Good Alliance? So basically, it is a mobilizing framework that collaborates between businesses, volunteers, the third sector, and organizations. It provides resources, it provides human resources, tech resources, so that we can deliver change and support into the third sector. And the key aim is to aggregate, amplify, and augment the existing Tech for Good activity across the UK using this platform, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So the three pillars of the Tech Alliance and the three areas that they're looking to tackle are social justice, inclusion, and equality. So supporting those affected by poverty and trauma, digital inclusion, and equality of opportunity. There's a skills and talent development pillar, which addresses the significant shortage of digital skills, as mentioned previously, around just the number of people that have access to the internet and lack those basic tech skills. Careers in tech, and also mentorship and guidance for those in the tech sector. And then environment and climate change, so technology for sustainability, climate justice, and data. So they're the three pillars. Very quick infographic as to how this works. So you've got your three pillars there that we just talked about. What we then have is projects within those three pillars. So, you know, businesses and third sector organizations get to suggest, you know, what are the projects that will help to tackle these aspects within these three pillars. What we then have is partners. So we have partners that are going to support this activity. So this is partners from the third sector, not-for-profit environment, where they will contribute these ideas and these projects. They'll say, this is a project that we have that we want to suggest to the Tech Alliance, that we want to work together to solve. And then we have businesses, companies, organizations who want to dedicate some of the time, some of the resources to tackle some of these challenges. And they get mapped into these different projects. And then you have the pool of additional volunteers, people that want to contribute, and they can come from a number of different sources. And a few recognizable names there. And what they will do is they will provide their time and their effort into these. So what you end up having is a platform that essentially enables a collaboration between companies, volunteers, and third sector organizations to collectively tackle some of these challenges that we see emerging in front of us. So very quickly, the program here, it's an annual membership. There's lots and lots of benefits for it, but I wanted to sort of point out a couple of key things. We talked earlier about not being able to really measure and recognize the contribution that this sector makes to the economy. As part of this, recognition of volunteer schemes will be a key part of it. So people getting recognized for the work that they do, enabling them to add that to the CV of capabilities and experience that they have supporting this type of activity. And then there's a whole host of benefits that businesses have for being part of this. A couple of key highlights here is something that is maybe not talked a lot about, which is skilled volunteering. You know, I think many of us have been involved in voluntary projects and very, very worthy voluntary projects, but you know, a lot of these voluntary time, voluntary days, voluntary weeks that businesses allow their employees to have, basically end up with people going and doing work in maybe a local scout hut or you know, helping correct damaged fences, or you know, really, really valuable work. But actually, what the third sector, as we've just talked about, really does need is people taking their skills that are unique to this industry and taking it to businesses where they really do need that skill in them. So taking tech talent into third sector organizations that need that talent, that can't afford that talent, and really making change for good. Whole host of other reasons and other benefits, but I am running rapidly out of time. So I wanted to leave you with you know, a final slide that, you know, this alliance is good for business, it's good for people, it's good for customers, it's good for society, and ultimately it's going to help us shape a better future. So this QR code here, hopefully I'm going to leave it up here for enough time for you to get your phones out and scan that QR code. What this takes you to is a landing page, which is basically just to register your interest. All it is at this moment in time is register your interest, put your name, your company details on there, and people from the Tech Alliance will get back in touch with you to talk about the next steps. But thanks for listening, and hope that's sparked something to get maybe our tech sector really, you know, enabling some of the opportunities that exist within supporting the third sector. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Graham. And just as Graham was speaking there, I think I'm remembering this correctly, that Billy Connolly once pointed to Drum Chapel and said there could be an America Cup winning skipper in there, but we'll never know. You know, unless people are actually given the opportunity to demonstrate what they can do, unless they are exposed to the technology or the skills or whatever is actually required, they never get the chance to find out. So what Graham's talking about there is actually an incredibly useful thing to do, not just for the individuals, but for society as a whole. We all benefit if they get the chance to sort of realise their potential. Just to point out, at the end of these three speakers, there will be a chance to ask questions. We've got microphones live in the hall. If you are of a shy disposition, however, and a couple of people tend to be, questions can be asked via Slido. Just scan the QR or enter the code. Okay, they'll come up on my phone. They'll come up there too, but sometimes the questions come in so fast, they disappear before I get the chance to ask them. So having it on the phone is actually quite useful at the same time. Our next speaker is Leanne Fitzpatrick, who's Director of Data Science at the Financial Times. And Leanne wants to talk about how you go about embedding cultural change. Leanne.
Good morning, and thanks very much to Graham as well for a fantastic setting the day to the human element, which leads me nicely into what I want to talk about today, which is that I work in data science. I've worked in data science for many years. I do that now at the FT. Don't worry, I'm not a journalist. I don't work in the editorial team, slightly different version. So if anybody wants to ask me about John Byrne Murdoch, you can, but my team sits very differently. We support all of the product and functionality that actually is underneath the FT. So when you see Pink or FT Live or parts of our B2B organization, data science sits underneath that. So when we think about an impact, right? So I'm talking about the unwanted realities of making an impact with data science. Well, recently, it's all in the news at the moment, we've seen an impact happen that NASA sent a little dart into space and set an asteroid off its course. And if we think about what that means for us, right? Well, if we go back to Newton's first law of motion and we think about how the fact that everything is either at rest or something's in a uniform motion, things don't change unless they are forced to. And so if we go back to all of our organizations, and we're thinking about our business BAU, and it's probably and hopefully linked to your business strategy. And your asteroid comes along that resembles some kind of new technology, people change, merger and acquisition, competitors, funding and revenue, etc., etc. And that hopefully is going to knock your business slightly off course for hopefully what resembles an improved business strategy. But this stuff is really, really hard. So when we think about what good impact actually looks like, this is an oversimplification, but generally it needs to be measurable. So we actually need to figure out what that outcome is by measuring it. It needs to be positive in the sense that it needs to be continuous and enacting continuous positive change. And there needs to be some kind of element of change management aside that. Now, like I said, it's really hard. If we think about Sisyphus, generally, he couldn't exert enough force to actually change the motion. And in data science, it's exactly the same. So what are the things that we can be thinking about when we go back to our data science organizations and our digital change through AI, machine learning, and data science? Well, for the most part, we're still stuck in an era where companies really do think that we can just take some data, we can apply some machine learning, and suddenly, out the back of that, there's some kind of business value. But the reality is that we're still kind of somewhat underpinned by this huge complex raft of technology and governance that undersits that. So when we think about our data, we need to have really good foundations. So that's enabling the data science team to actually be able to select the right data, source it, and synthesize that information together. When it comes down to the machine learning elements, we need to couple our data engineering and our modeling together. So that's around kind of exploring the data that we have as an organization, which means that we need to have good foundations to actually source that data. We need to be able to clean it, normalize it, and set it up in a world that we can actually do some predictive or prescriptive modeling on top of that. We need to be capabilities in order to train our models and actually tune them. And then actually outputting that into business value is all about our I'm doing a Wednesday morning, operationalizing our, apologies, not even the speakers can get it right, in terms of actually our deployment, right? So for a data scientist, we hear this all the time, there's no good point having a nice, predictive, valuable model sitting on a laptop and not enabled into production. And all of this needs to be underpinned in the world we are today around a good ethic framework. That would be kind of having your legal and compliance team involved, understanding the transparency with whatever your end user, that could be an organization or an individual or internal clients within your company. Understanding any historical biases, whether that's in consumer data or just in your general data. We're in a constantly shifting market. Information is dynamic, it changes all the time, and data needs to be secure. All the stuff that we hear all the time. So, what does this mean for data science? Well, you've seen the Gartner hype cycle. It's evolved over the last few years, hopefully, and we're still at this point where now people think that AI, machine learning, is all at this plateau of productivity, right? So generally, it's assumed to have believed that we've gone through this huge era of hype, from 2011, when it was data science is the sexiest job of the 21st century, and now data scientists are doing a great job, everything is totally productive. But for a lot of organizations, there's a huge mismanagement of expectations, right? The company sees Homer Simpson, if you like, in his beautiful body. But the reality is that most data science or data organizations are struggling to hold up what there might be their machine learning capabilities, the data capabilities. And I talk about things being built on a house made of sand. And that's an expectation mismanagement. So what does that mean in terms of our actual data science realities? So I think these things need to be coupled together in the sense that we have our technical implementation, our data science team culture, and our organizational embedding of whatever outputs we need. Now, there's a lot of words on here, but I'm going to kind of talk through this because each of these could be a huge keynote in themselves. But from a technical implementation standpoint, what I'm talking about here is the realities of actually the capability to deploy and develop data science, machine learning, and put that into production. So that can be your data, your model, and your code management. It can be actually the open source toolkits and languages like R and Python being enabled to put those into production. Your feature and data engineering, I talked a lot about kind of the dependency of good foundations in your data warehouse, your data platform. The dependency management, so actually data science has a lot of toolkits and packages, and conflict of dependencies can be really a struggle. Actually being able to scale and load balance, so we're in the era now of mass kind of GPU and kind of looking at image processing, natural language capabilities with machine learning, and those take a huge amount of in-memory resource, so being able to scale and load balance that so that in real time or in production, you can actually get a response. Version control and lineage, so this is all around kind of our versioning of our models and making sure that things are up to date in production and also have that historic tracking. And monitoring and observability, so when things go wrong, we can actually make a change. Data science team culture, on the other hand, is much more around humans and the people, right? So we just heard about humanization. What we're looking for in our people is trust, curiosity, and knowledge. Why? Well, you need the knowledge to be able to actually find the right data and business problems to solve. You need to be curious to actually go out and find those. And you need to enable a culture of trust where people can identify business challenges, identify business problems to be solved with data science, and enable those people to get on with it. We need good model and code review processes, great documentation, collaborative teams and squads so that things don't deprecate, and also things aren't built in silos, mentoring and coaching, cross-functional upskilling, and the correct people and skills. And finally, one of the hardest of all is actually organizational embedding. So this is around our change in our decision-making behavior. So for the most part, data science is going to be outputting some kind of piece of information that there should be a decision-making process off the back of that. What I mean by that is that, for example, really simple scenario in a subscription-based world, in a subscription-based organization, we might want to put out a probability that somebody is either going to subscribe to the FT News subscription or no longer go on. Fundamentally, if we put out that probability, we want to see a change in the way the business then treats that customer for the positive. We need to have good governance and compliance around actually how the organization is using these prescriptive and predictive models. There's still a lot of sensitivities around our data and particularly around personal data. The org structure in terms of our organization and understanding how data science can make a difference to different parts of the business. Competing priorities, so making sure that it stacks up to your business strategy, and value recognition and attribution. That's a lot, as I said, and really we're still in an era where the technical implementation is still often assumed to be the main culprit. And that's kind of easy to understand because when you look at actually what goes into development of a data science model, you're going from kind of ideation of your actual business problem and the way that you might use machine learning to solve that. You need to get a lot of domain understanding in terms of the way that the business is currently addressing that challenge and the way that the like nuances in the data and the data that's been captured. You then need to kind of go and prepare that data so that it's fit for purpose for actually development of your model, and then actually serve that model into production. And this is what we refer to now as kind of machine learning ops. And this, you may have heard this kind of think it's a new buzzword, but the reality is that this has been something that we've needed a lot more attention on in our community, in data science, machine learning for a long time. So you might know this as AI ops or ML ops, but essentially it's all around the machine learning operations and making sure that actually those outputs happen. And for the most part, what DevOps means to software engineering, i.e. it's the culture around how you do continuous integration, continuous deployment, and deployment practice, MLOps means to data science. And that gives us tools and frameworks for data engineering, all the things I talked about with version control of data, continuous integration, and continuous delivery pipelines. And what we've seen is there's a huge proliferation of tools in that space now, which is great, because we're now uncoupling the problem of actually putting data science into production so people can make an impact with it from actually just developing. This is a really oversaturated kind of diagram, but it gives you a flavor of just the vast number of toolkits that are out there to solve this production problem. But that's all well and good. But back to my little asteroid, and actually, how is that going to make a business impact? And so the things I want to leave you with today is 3 things. When I go back to the measurement, the positivity, and change, what are the things that data scientists should be thinking about? So within your organization, you should be thinking about how is data science actually going to measure the change that they have? Well, calculating return on investment in machine learning is really, really hard. The gains are really complex if the product already exists. So if we're making a change to a process, actually recognizing what those gains are isn't a simple linear process. In terms of the cost of investment, there's many unknowns, the amount of resource that's taken, the amount of technology capabilities that are spun up to support something. And then underpinning all of that, justifying the experiments that actually never get deployed in data science is really difficult. And so we have a bit of an attribution problem where the calculations are complicated because the value isn't just in one number in machine learning. And this is the case in any business change, right? That it's often spread across multiple departments, teams, business units, and programs of work. So measuring ROI for a data science project generally ends up as a project in itself, which you're not going to justify spinning up another data science team just to justify why you have a data science team. So be clear on your business KPIs so that your data science team or your machine learning engineers can start to do some value mapping. So you should already have a set, hopefully, of business metrics that support your business strategy. And that should have a diligence on value. So what that enables the data science team to do, if you say to them, I'm challenging you to translate this into what this means in terms of our baseline KPIs, they can take a performance metric like maximum likelihood estimation, which they will use all the time, but perhaps doesn't mean anything in terms of our stakeholders, and then transformationally change that to actually something that matters. So if maybe it's bottom line revenue or lifetime value, EBITDA, data scientists can map that through. So in this example, I've got an NLP system that provides some recommendation or personalization. The way that that's underpinned, the performance metric is actually around how accurate is my detection algorithm around my natural language processing. So if I guess a context, do I get it right? But actually what that means in terms of bottom line revenue is that if our search query results improve, our user engagement improves, and by engagement improving, we see our bottom lines improving. Positivity. I think there's still a lot of kind of not looking at your own needs when it comes to data science and machine learning. So instead of, I think there's a lot of still buzz around the fact that data scientists have kind of said, go and solve this very difficult to solve business problem, rather than just addressing a really simple problem that you have today. And what that means is that, therefore, data science are oversaturated with new data science projects versus the time and the resource they have. Generally, time and resource will stay fairly flat once you have an organization of a certain size, but you'll be expecting more and more of your data science team. But the reality is that actually it should look something like this, that we should be reviewing what products and projects and services are not working for the business. So empower that data science team to do qualitative and quantitative user research on their models and their outputs, deprecation and archiving of services that are no longer in use, regularly reviewing their projects with high maintenance resource and costs, and then bringing more projects from minimum viable product to actual maturity, where there's actually a value from that measurement piece. And then reviewing all production projects, not just from a technical stance, but also from a human stance in the sense of ethics, governance, and manual reliability evaluation. And the final piece is around embedding change. So generally, our data science capability will be made up of something that looks like this, where you have some data scientists, some kind of engineering, a machine learning engineer or a few machine learning engineers, now MLOps engineers to support that architecture and that Devops type of capability, or machine learning scientists. And for a long time, what we've said is, these do different roles. They're the data explorer, they're the data translator, they tell great data stories, or they're the great data product owner. But in a world of high attrition in tech and data at the moment, actually what we need to see exhibiting more from our data roles is these types of qualities. So when we're educating people to become the data stewards, the data scientists of the future, they should also be specializing in understanding, maybe they want to be thinking about change management and how data science makes a difference with change management. Maybe they're the champion for kind of governance and strategy. Maybe they're also a great person about thinking about resource dependencies, and therefore could be a delivery manager. And so we need to start enabling the skills, not just for kind of a combination of business skills, math skills, stats skills, and computer programming, but actually the reality of how we embed change. And I could talk way more about this, but my closing thing that I want to say today is that making an impact in data science isn't just about this technical implementation and what we've coined that as MLOps. We need to bring all these things together, and that's what I refer to as machine learning operations, is when you bring the cultural and the embedding together. And that's the only way we're going to continue to make impact in our businesses. Thanks.
I said, any questions on that, there will be a chance to do it later. When we're talking about killing off projects, reminded again of the Cambridge academic Quilla Couch, who was talking about writing and said to a young academic, you must learn to murder your darlings. You have to make decisions sometimes that are uncomfortable, unpleasant, but you still have to do it. Third speaker in this session, Ed Mitchard, co-founder and chief scientific officer of Space Intelligence. Ed's going to be talking about how he's using satellite data to make better decisions. Ed.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here to speak to this group. I also have a position as a professor at the University of Edinburgh, which I do part-time, and where the company started from, and I'm a bit worried that this is going to tie into or become a lecture, so I'll try and stay away from that. But I am trying to educate you in satellite data, because there's a deluge of free satellite information that we as taxpayers have paid for, a lot of this through European Union or the European Space Agency. And as a group of technology companies and wider companies and government, we're not using that data to its full potential. So here is an example of a satellite flying around the Earth collecting data to show you what this is like. This is a satellite called Sentinel-2, operated by the European Space Agency. And you see it collects narrow strips of, in this case, miraculously cloud-free information, and gradually builds up a picture of the Earth. And it takes the two Sentinel-2 satellites about 5 days to build up an image of the whole Earth. That is at 10-meter resolution, so there'd be several pixels in this room. And that frequency of update is something we've never had before. Data has existed since about 2017, and it's going to carry on well into the 2030s in a consistent way. This is a fantastic opportunity for us as humans to use this freely available satellite data. So there are three main types of satellite data. I'm going to lecture mode. The one I just showed you and you're all probably most familiar with is optical satellite data. It's basically a camera on a satellite. It's nothing that sophisticated. It looks at the world's surface using sunlight and detects in a range of different radiometric bands how much light is reflected back to the satellite. This can be done using the red, green, and blue that we see through with our eyes. Actually, the atmosphere isn't that transparent in those wavelengths, and we tend to use near-infrared, going into further infrared wavelengths more, because this light has to go through the atmosphere twice, and it tends to be less noisy. Here is a real example. This is a bit of Brazil showing some forest and some farmland through a few years of Sentinel-2 data. And you see after harvest, the forest patches and the agriculture patches look very different in color. Whereas if you get an image at the wrong time of year, try and time this right, everything looks green. It'd be very hard to differentiate those two. You also see those pesky clouds popping up. About half the world is cloud covered at any one point. About 70% of the time for Scotland, as we all know. So getting cloud-free images is particularly difficult over the world. So optical data is great in that you get these spectral responses, and it's very widely used. And clearly, if you keep looking at the same place again and again, eventually, even in Scotland, you will see through the clouds. But these clouds are a problem, particularly if you want to know what happened yesterday. If it's cloudy, there is no way you can see with optical data, and never mind how many times you take a picture of the same place. If there's clouds sitting over it, you won't see it. Similarly, they use data relying on the sun, and it's dark quite a lot of the time, about half in 24 hours. Actually, if you're in the far northern hemisphere and it's winter, you get very little sunlight, and the sunlight you do get is at a very low angle, which causes weird shadows and things. So optical data is useful, but not always available. There's therefore some other types of data that we can use, and while I don't think the world is using even optical data as much as they should be, it's freely available, quite easy to access. The other two types of data I'm talking about is definitely very rarely used outside specialist companies like ours. So the first one I'm going to talk about is radar satellite data, might be known as synthetic aperture radar or SAR data. This is an active sensor, which means it's a more powerful satellite that sends pings of its own microwave radiation at the surface, and incredibly can detect how much comes back to the satellite, even though it's typically orbiting maybe 700 kilometers away. The amount of radiation that comes back to the satellite depends how kind of scattery the surface is. So if I was firing it at this room, we've got lots of chairs and people, and it probably all scatter and bounce back. Whereas if I was firing it at a lake, most of it would bounce off in the other direction, and it would look dark. This can be really useful for my field. So I will talk a bit more about space intelligence later, but we mostly map the carbon stored in forests and how land cover is changing. And this technical looking graph here is meant to show you that radar backscatter increases as forest biomass, which is the bottom axis here, increases. So basically the more scattery trees you get, the more radar backscatter you get. So you can use this type of thing to see the difference in the amount of carbon stored in forests, which is quite exciting. So this should look a bit familiar, hopefully. This is exactly the same scene you just saw, but using the Sentinel-1 satellite, which is a radar satellite. Once again, as you see through the year, you see the agriculture changing as crops grow up and then are harvested. There's no clouds this time, as radar data is a longer wavelength and can see straight through most clouds. So this data is really useful in that you can use it to understand something about the roughness and the moisture content of the surface, which translates back to whether there's a crop there, maybe what type of crop that is, how much carbon there is in the forest, maybe what's going on with a bridge in your city. But also the changes through the year give you really interesting information about, for example, when harvest happens. And the ability to collect data at night and through clouds means that if you want a SAR image, a radar image, in 3 hours' time, you can get one and you'll know you'll be able to see what's happening. It's really exciting. There's loads of new companies popping up. Synthetic aperture radar data used to be the preserve only of space agencies and great big bus-sized satellites. And there's quite a few holes in the archive where there just isn't much data. Whereas now there's about 5 different commercial companies, mostly US-based, for example, Umbra, Capella, a few others, ICEYE from Finland, that are collecting this data several times a day over the whole world, and they can point their satellites where you want. So this is a data set that we should all be getting behind and using. The final one I'm going to talk about is a bit more exotic. This is LiDAR, which is the equivalent of radar, but sending pulses of laser radiation at the surface. There are a couple of satellites doing this right now. The one I've got here is JEDI, which is operating from the International Space Station, and sends 25-meter wide pulses of laser light down that then reflect back to the satellite, and the time it takes between the first and the last photons to come back from that pulse to the satellite, given information about the height of trees. This is kind of the holy grail for us, trying to look at the forest carbon stored in these trees and information about their height and density and health. Unfortunately, it needs a lot of power to operate. It's basically sending a laser beam through a big telescope, and it can only do kind of stripes over the world. It doesn't cover the whole area. So this is an example where we've built up over several years all the different stripes over an area, and we find a very good relationship. It's my scatter plot on the right, much better than from radar, between biomass and the height that you get from these. However, to turn this into a carbon map, we have to fill in the gaps using machine learning and the other satellite data sets we talked about, because this map showing stripes of where the carbon is and then big gaps is not very useful for any kind of business intelligence. So why am I talking about forest carbon? Well, forest carbon is the main thing that we trade in nature-based solutions. The main way you actually get money for preserving forests. The forest in the tropics is through effectively selling, keeping that carbon locked up in the tree trunks. Forests have loads of other benefits in terms of biodiversity and people who live and rely on them, but it's that forest carbon held in the tree trunks that we can easily measure, we can measure from space, and that there's a direct offset between someone burning a fossil fuel here and hopefully not releasing carbon from cutting down trees. As I said, we can do these point-based measurements of forests using something like a LiDAR satellite, but we need to combine that with lots of other radar and optical data in order to make maps of biomass. I have a little video hopefully showing this working for one of our study sites, which is a national park in Madagascar, where there is forest on the hills and tends to be lower forest biomass on the lowlands. So you see this kind of line of red is the Jedi shots going over the landscape. So the height was meant to represent how tall the forest was at that point. And then we combine the different rate sensing layers using a machine learning model to make these types of maps of biomass. And it's this biomass that we can map through time that enables conservation decisions to be made and enables the generation of carbon credits, this sellable thing you can do to help pay for conserving forests. We can turn these maps into intelligence. It's increasingly obvious to me as a scientist who's gone into business that producing data sets is only very much the start. We have to get the information that people genuinely need. And in the case of these type of landscapes, a map of carbon storage looks lovely. Companies will put that in glossy brochures, but they won't use it to actually do anything unless you find out what number or what information they need. Often they just want to know, is it holding carbon stocks constant or is it losing carbon? And they want to know how many tons of carbon it has, ideally with an uncertainty range. So often you give a client an uncertainty range because they say they want it and then that disappears and they report a number as a crystal fact nonetheless, which is a challenge for communication. And they also, as we all know in terms of this transformation theme we're talking about today, they don't want a map sent to them as a geotiff or uploaded on a server to use. Often they want a dashboard or a web system where they can interact with those maps and get that one number with uncertainty for different areas. So here's a dashboard we built for a bit of South America, where a client has asked us to do carbon maps over some different projects they own, and they want to be able to click on those project sites and get the latest information on what the carbon storage and the land cover change is for those areas. So this is the type of service that we are offering for companies, but I believe there's many other opportunities for companies to do this themselves for many different areas, or use this kind of information to understand their natural capital and track different things they're interested in, where their footprint is using satellite data. We've also been working at a bigger scale with government, which again, government has engaged with satellite data sets in many different ways. They fund them after all, and this is an example of that happening successfully. So Scottish Government, through NatureScot, produces something called the Natural Capital Asset Index once a year. It's associated with their annual kind of accounts to work out how valuable Scotland's natural ecosystems are and whether those are kind of more or less valuable than the year before. So we did a bit of work where we produced land cover maps of all of Scotland for multiple years at 20-meter resolution using those satellite data sets I talked about earlier, dividing Scotland into 22 different land cover types. Won't surprise you to know there are lots of different types of bog, lots of different types of forests, and trying to see how those have changed or are changing and how those relate to natural capital, because clearly degraded grassland, for example, has less value than native broadleaf timber might have, though those values are different in different ways. So, for example, there is controversy. I was chatting before we started to one of the other speakers about, for example, a Sitka spruce plantation, which may have low biodiversity value, but huge commercial value, because those good quality trees are very valuable and might have great value in terms of climate, really, because it can provide a sustainable source of timber that can be used for buildings here in Scotland, rather than us maybe importing timber from the tropics, causing a lot of deforestation and loss of biodiversity. So it's beyond my brief to work out how to value these different things, but by providing government with the layers, they can, working with them, we can make dashboards again that help them make these decisions. So in this case, we looked at how land cover was changing, codified that land cover change into something that was usable by the end users, and turned that into this natural capital asset index, which Scotland reports as a single number. So producing tens of millions of pixels and going back to, I think it's 1.04 was the number for 2020. So overall, I believe that satellite data can be hugely valuable for meeting sustainability goals. And hopefully I've given you a bit of a flavor of that. It can easily be used to discover the carbon storage and land cover history. And that can be used for assets or supply chains, basically any company or government that has a footprint, an area of where that footprint is. It can be useful to monitor what's going on in terms of the land cover change there. That can include monitoring for compliance. So lots of companies and frameworks are demanding that we sign up for zero deforestation, or in England, biodiversity net gain is now on the statute books. So companies have to abide by that. I suspect there's lots of companies doing transformation projects or scrambling around and thinking they should, to start making sure internally that they're complying with those things and wanting some way of showing externally that they are. I believe satellite data is paramount to producing those kinds of numbers and demonstrating to consumers or regulators that they're meeting these targets. I hope there are going to be new financial instruments. Increasingly, there's green bonds, so bonds where they're matched to, for example, I don't know, Unilever could issue a bond and get a lower rate in terms of interest as long as it met its commitments in terms of zero deforestation palm oil, or you can imagine a tropical forest government doing a similar thing with its national debt. There's also lots of these carbon offset projects that are being sold. Increasingly, companies are buying up carbon offsets or committing to protecting bits of forest. But forests are fundamentally at risk from things like hurricanes or fire, and that carbon can disappear, or political instability. I've seen the recent case in Ukraine. There are several carbon projects in Ukraine that have been bombed, which I don't think would have been originally thought of. So insurance products need to move on for there. And for all of these things, again, satellite data is going to be critical to correctly pricing and checking those instruments. ESG is a hot topic, obviously. Increasingly, it's becoming normalized in asset management to think about the environmental, social, and governance of different companies. And it really frustrates me that lots of those metrics, when you dig into it, they seem to be based on self-reporting. So a company produces a ton of reports, a load of PDFs online you can download, and then an asset manager checks against that PDF to say, okay, tick, they've committed to meet this standard or whatever. I would love them to use satellite data, use these type of dashboards to genuinely check if these companies are complying with their obligations or exceeding them. There's also climate impact and climate risk. We know that the world is warming up, and that's having lots of impacts in terms of flooding and changing weather events, and we need to make better maps of where those risks are, understand that climate risks impact on our companies and governments and people, and how we can adjust to that. And satellite data saying what the current situation is absolutely critical to that. So it's part of that puzzle. Finally, I'll just say a tiny bit about space intelligence. We were founded in 2018, and we use satellite data to make these products. We're 27 people sitting on George Street in Edinburgh, and if you're interested in what we're doing, come and talk to me afterwards and come and visit us. Thanks very much.
Some fascinating stuff in there. Right, chance now to ask questions of any of our first three speakers. As I said, there's two ways of doing this. We've got live microphones in the hall. So if you want to ask a question in person, stick your hand up, or you can flash on that QR code and ask it via Slido. Okay? So has anybody got a question to kick off with? I know nobody ever wants to start, but somebody's got to inevitably. It's usually me. Okay, I will kick off. I'm going to put this to Graham for a start. I can see what it is you're trying to do, but if, looking back historically, technical advances have actually exacerbated inequality, how do we break that cycle effectively?
I think that's a very good question. I think we have to start somewhere, and I think refocusing is probably a good starting point. And I think that the idea of this 1%, contributing 1% of time, 1% of resources, you can see the impact that makes, and it's massive. Because I think that if we start to bridge the gap, having everybody contribute 1% of time and resources will start something. And that's what we need. We need a movement. We need a movement that's going to try and flip the balance. So I think that's, as a simple starting point, there's probably far more educated people that would be able to give a much better answer than that. But I think that, it's on us all to try and contribute something to make that change. And, having been involved in the tech army for the last few years and spoken to volunteers and the organizations to which this movement has impacted, it's unbelievable, just the benefits on both sides, the benefits on the people that volunteer the time and the development, the pride that they've got from it themselves, and then the impact that that's had on the not-for-profit or the charitable organization that they supported. It's game changing for them. It's actually a matter of survival or not. I think it's just about awareness, starting somewhere, and starting small and building. The example of JP Morgan that put up there, they started with a very, very small team, and now they have an enormous team that's 100% dedicated to supporting third sector organizations. Not saying everyone has to do that, and many people would say that there's not many companies that have the resource to be able to do that. But if I think the strap line from the summit that we had back in April, that one of our guest speakers talked about, is those that can should. And I think if we just take that mantra of those that can should, because not everyone can, but those that can, if they do and they contribute in some way, shape or form, then that's what's going to kickstart the movement.
Any thoughts on that, Leanne?
I think I would say I'm very tapped into communities, right? So especially in the data space, the community, and I think there's a lot happening at the ground level. And if we totally appreciate that there's a divide between tech that's available for all, particularly if you look at the identity space, right? We still assume everybody can have a digital identity. That's just not practical, and Graham's presentation really highlighted that. However, I think there's a ground force effort that's really changing, rather than it being, I think historically everything's been very top down. I think some of what Graham's pointed out, there's a very bottom up approach that's starting to happen. And I think the more we can kind of divide and conquer through that bottom up, as generalistic as that sounds. So for example, I live in Manchester, and we've got Open Data Manchester that's there. And a lot of what they're doing is all around how do we put digital assets in low income homes that can't do it. So they've put a very cheap satellite in people's gardens to be able to actually monitor the bird species that are actually occurring in Manchester. This is a really low effort way of actually something that's happening for social good, that perhaps people that, previously people might have looked out their windows and logged something, cheap piece of technology that can be democratized in that way to support. And so I think things will happen much more from a bottom up way rather than a top down.
This is not a political point, but I saw the Home Secretary yesterday saying, poor people are not as poor as you think. They've got mobile phones, they've got tablets and things like that, but if you're applying for benefits, it more or less inevitably has to be done online these days. It's not an optional extra. You have to do these things. Ed, there's some questions there that actually fit in with you. Do you use drones to complement satellite data?
So yes, the drones have kind of grown up over the 15 years or so I've been doing this. I've crashed drones of various different types in various different parts of the world. It has to be said, it's more of a, even with more operational ones now, it's still quite an experimental thing. In general, you've got a small camera on a small quadcopter or a small little plane, and you're collecting tiny kind of postage stamp bits of the world with lots of little images you have to stitch together. You can get this fantastically rich, high-resolution information for me on trees or on buildings and things, but it's almost more like ground data, like the kind of information I get from visiting a forest and measuring a tree and taking a photo of it. It's such a different scale to the satellites, it's hard to use it as kind of a stepping stone data set between field data and the satellite data. So Space Intelligence, the company, we don't really use drone data at all. We do use some ground information, but because we want to produce operational maps over very large areas, the drone data just isn't that useful. But for testing sensors and pushing the boundary of what we can do, I do a lot of work on forest degradation and biodiversity mapping at the university, and their drones are really useful and important in terms of developing new features. But I think you'd be crazy to try and design an operational system using drones.
I love that question there. Where does the cloud fit into your work? not the Scottish ones.
Yeah, we deal with terabytes of data, so nothing we do really, apart from little bits of experimentation, is on our computers here. We all work on MacBooks talking to the cloud, and we use AWS and GCP, Google Cloud platforms to do all the data analysis. I mean, our work is only possible because so much satellite data now is free and open from the major space agencies, from EU, and it's all stored in the cloud already, so we're not downloading massive data, dealing with it on our computers, and then uploading results. So yeah, we're very lucky to have those cloud infrastructure and the ability to turn on a chunky machine with a load of GPUs and turn it off again 10 minutes later once we've done the data analysis. It would be very hard to do a company like ours, or impossible to do it 10 years ago.
Okay. Interesting question. I'm going to paraphrase it to a certain extent, Leanne, because obviously these are all industry insiders here. You know, most people in this room fully understand the technology and the implications thereof. Most people in the public, and I would include myself in this, do not. We're deeply suspicious of it. So you see, what seems shiny and wonderful and new and full of promise to you might seem like a threat to me. How do you get around that?
Yeah, so I think GDPR is a brilliant thing in the sense of the guardrails we need around like personal data. But in terms of like the marketing exercise that went round GDPR, it was kind of like, I feel like to the general public, right, it's kind of like a scaremongering. And there's this big dichotomy, right, for us in like very commercial applications of machine learning, data science, AI, particularly where it touches on personal information, that actually there's been a huge lack of kind of good, I would personally say like customer experience, user design, and like marketing that actually showcases the value trade-off to an individual around the capabilities that we have. So, you know, people kind of like roughly understand it with Facebook, right? That you trade off your data for a kind of a network, whether or not you use Facebook or you like Facebook. Let's cast that aside a second, right? There's a trade-off there. There's a value trade-off between you're saying, I'm going to share my information so that I can tap into this network to get something back. I think it's really, really like not very well done in terms of what that could mean for something like the NHS and the trade-off of making sure that your data is much more democratized and federated through something like the NHS system, which is extremely complex, but having, you know, there's a whole trust piece around there. But like anything in terms of like, we've talked a lot about like social good or ESG today, but like anywhere where somebody is sacrificing information about themselves, that's where like I specifically feel like this public's perception is that Big Brother is watching me, they're using my data in a way that I'm not happy with. But like as soon as you do a research question about if your data was used to give you a value, which is that you end up tapping into, I don't know, like, so you either get monetized for it, or actually like there's something like useful to you, that i.e. when you next time you go to your GP, right, they've coupled together everything from your smartwatch, they've coupled every hospital appointment you've had, coupled with actually your legacy of kind of your NHS GP appointments. How amazing would that be for you as a consumer of the NHS to be able to be like, oh, I don't have to re-explain every single symptom I've had, that information. And then there's a value trade-off there. And I think my point more is about the marketing exercise that needs to go around that, and the customer experience and research side. Like we need a lot more like qualitative research about what people think about how their data is used, and actually showcasing it in a way that there are poor uses. You know, like I think we all are aware of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and these things are unfortunately still happening. GDPR in the, you know, the EU and in the UK is one way of kind of trying to mitigate that. I think these guardrails are more and more important, along with the marketing exercise, to help people understand why they can get something out of kind of sharing information.
A few years ago, when the Cambridge Analytica scandal kicked off, I actually put a question up the chain of command on the BBC saying, we have a duty of care to, you know, the people who are consuming our product, our Facebook page, because they're license payers. So, you know, how safe is this? And they kind of poo-pooed it. You know, and then within 6 months, they shut down every individual program Facebook page and tried to unify the whole thing to make it safe. I'm not sure that was the correct response, but don't know. This question has come through for Graham. Do you actually work with social enterprise organizations?
Within the, do you mean within the Tech Alliance?
Within yes, Tech for Good Alliance.
Yes. So, I mean, I just for full disclosure, I don't. I volunteer with the Scottish Tech Army purely from a business perspective. So I support them with introductions to other organisations and using, podcasts and conferences to promote what they do. There's a core team within the Scottish Tech Army who run the Scottish Tech Army and also the Tech for Good Alliance. But yes, they work with social enterprises as well as third sector and not-for-profit organisations. And they've got a really close connection with the Scottish Government in terms of how they can expand the offering of the Scottish Tech Army out to a wider group of beneficiaries.
Okay. I'm going to put this one to Ed because something you said actually made me laugh. The companies that you're working for, very often, they're delighted that you're doing all this research and that you're coming up with really deep insights. And then when it comes to the punch, they don't actually want that depth of insight. They want a number. So how do you improve technical literacy so that you could give them a little more information and it would be of benefit to Joe Public?
I mean, maybe we don't need to. I mean, talking about some of the data science things, like I think sometimes we're tempted to over-engineer and over-invent something. We find all these cool models and make these fantastic range of outputs. And often you're trying to support a decision, or in my case, make sure a company isn't doing deforestation. And maybe a number is enough, at least for some of that user group. I think we have to make sure that we have the rich information available for those of the companies or those that are needing to use it. And there's definitely an education part of it. So with space intelligence, our sales journey is typically very long. It can be well over a year because we're often trying to sell a service that there's no budget line for, there's no history, we're not replacing an existing supplier. So you have to educate various different bits of the business in the need for this spend. And clearly the message you do talking to a technical person who knows something about satellite data is very different to a finance director or a senior person who might be making the decision who knows nothing. And I think it's been a bit of a journey for us in terms of adjusting what messages we talk about and what slides we show, what kind of language we use when talking to those different groups. Yes, I don't mind if we end up with an ESG tick box with 3 ticks, if that's the output that the companies need. If that's powered by satellite data, that's much better than being powered by someone looking at a PDF. And I'd love someone to be able to click through and see a dashboard and see the imagery and see there are trees there. That would be great, but maybe that's not necessary. We don't need to over-engineer it.
Okay, interesting. Any questions from the floor? I'm contractually obligated to keep on asking.
Can I ask you a question, Ed? Is that right?
Yeah.
Obviously, we were chatting earlier, and you mentioned, obviously, hope you don't mind me saying that, obviously, building houses with timber is actually the most sustainable way of building houses. And but we don't maybe get the credit for that. Is there a way we could use the technology you've talked about there to be able to sort of bring that to life?
It's I'd love to do anything to bring to life the fact that if we build a building, like a lot of this building, out of wood rather than out of fossil fuel using cement and concrete, then that's got a massive carbon benefit as well as looking very nice. Timber is very strong, and I'm a big advocate of that separately. I think there's a role for legislation, sadly. So I think you can do a kind of positive message around timber. It's one of many examples. But we need to have a negative message around the emissions embedded in lots of the things we use for building, a lot of the food we eat. I'd love there to be CO2 footprints on food packaging, for example, showing the couple of order of magnitude more carbon emissions for 100 grams of beef than there is for 100 grams of a replacement protein that doesn't come from an animal belching out methane. There's things I'd love us to communicate, but it's not in the interests of companies to communicate them themselves. I don't think you can force companies to shoot themselves in the foot. Expect them to do that off their own bat. That's got to come through government legislation, I feel.
There was something that you said, Leanne, that affected the difficulty of calculating ROI on machine learning. If you can't accurately predict what the outcome is going to be, it comes back to what engineers used to refer to as a WAG, a wild-ass guess. It becomes an action of faith. It doesn't matter how technologically advanced you are, sometimes you've got to guess.
Yeah, and I think that happens in business all the time, right? Any business decision you make is based on fear, faith, and finance, right? So it's and the trade-off between those things is if it is a WAG, right, which is like a wild guess at whether or not that's going to pay off, you might be capitalized in a way that you can invest that resource. And that doesn't, when I say capitalize, that doesn't mean like in a commercial sense, that just might mean in a resource sense. Like, for example, Ed, everything that you're doing is very research focused, right? And there's the faith part, which is that this is going to be beneficial to the wider good, and that by going on this journey, there is going to be like investment from the global populace that we need this information to actually have a sustainable future. And but without that risk, like if I guess, Ed, if you were to take yourself back to 2010 and be like, how am I going to actually stick a value on what 2020, using satellite image to improve things might look like, it would be a really difficult thing. So I think without the wild guesses, we'd never be in a better future. But in a commercial organization, for the most part, you are having to make those trade-offs. So, there's going to be a, disruption versus innovation. Generally, you're going to hedge your bet on innovation over disruption because it's easier to reconcile the fear and the finance factor with that faith of the innovation. And I guess it goes back to Graham, a lot of what you said about, transformation and the human part of that there's, there's still like, we're all subjective no matter what. So there's only so much objectivity you can put around those measurements. But it is the organization's responsibility to work hand in hand with that data science team to at least make it better than a finger in the air guess. And where you do have, for the FT, right, one of our big KPIs is engagement, right? So, and data science, we were responsible for building that. So sometimes feel a bit difficult about marking our own homework. But, a lot of what we do sometimes has to be, I try and really make sure that we're evaluating that with respect to that engagement metric that we want to come back to.
There's a question come up on Slido which ties in rather well with that. So people's skills of yesterday get made redundant today. How do we balance drive for technological improvement whilst ensuring nobody gets left behind? Or is that an impossible wish? Graham, I'll give it to you for a start.
Wow. I think one of the stats that I didn't read out about the sort of village with 100 people is around education, and there's a huge amount of there's a very small percentage of people who have access to that type of education. So again, I think it is about those skills that maybe are disappearing. It's a big program of retraining, and I think there's a lot of great activities and initiatives on around retraining available. But I think that needs to be heightened. And in fact, one of the programs that the Scottish Tech Army supported with was exactly that, making reskilling and education available to more people. So I think that's probably the quickest and easiest way of bringing that to life is around the opportunity for reskilling and re-education for groups of people where skills, those skills that they've developed over the years are becoming redundant.
Ed, any thoughts?
It's a tricky one to contribute to from my standpoint, but yeah, I think it's critically important that we take machine learning in general and communicate the outputs, even if you're not communicating the technology and getting lost in it. I think that, well, I'm very lucky in that my company and things were basically producing maps, and you can make maps easy to see. Increasingly, the world has access to maps through their phones, and they're used to seeing satellite data. So it's about communicating like that rather than talking about the cool technology or the ways we produce those data sets. But yeah, I then get worried into things like uncertainty. You can simplify these things too much, and you get a decision maker with my single number again, but it's really an uncertainty and a range, and they do need to understand some of the technology that's gone behind that and the uncertainties that go through. So I don't know if I'm in a position to make an opinion on it, but that's the kind of issues we grapple with.
Do we? Do we genuinely do it? And that's not a facetious question. Do we need to understand the technology that goes behind it? Vast majority of people drive cars without having the faintest concept of how an internal combustion engine works.
Yes, but maybe someone who's trying to make a decision about whether to change from an internal combustion engine to an electric car and reshape their company that produces cars does need to know something about the technology. I agree, if you're just using the outputs, that's fine, but sometimes these machine learning models are being used, or these data sets are being used to make very big transformative decisions for companies or governments, and maybe they do need some understanding about what's going on.
I suspect this question came from somebody with a Jesuit education. This is for Leanne. When the organisation is growing, do you think the strategy should inform the technology, or the technology inform the strategy? Discuss.
That's a tough question. I guess, well, firstly, when we say the term like growing, it depends what size you're at. I guess simplifying it down, right, which is when it comes from a data technology standpoint, to me, you can kind of loosely split commercial organizations into two camps, right? Firstly, there's the side which is data in some capacity, whether that be machine learning or the data itself, is out ROI, i.e. we are outputting data-led services, whether that be the data themselves or predictive functionality or maps, to generate revenue or outputs that are consumed. There's another side, which is then examples like the FT, which is we use data to be able to inform like our overarching way of doing things. So, for example, like our recommendation strategy, right? We're going to use machine learning to make sure that everybody's experience on the FT is personalized to them. So in the first camp, I would say that the technology probably needs, so in the sense where your ROI is outrightly just data outputs or services, probably the technology strategy needs to support really drive the business in a way, because you won't be able to stand up a data output without a really robust tech strategy. On the other side, probably it's supporting your business strategy. Ideally, we would all just say everything's going to work hand in hand. We talk a lot at the FT about how our product and our technology strategy needs to really work much more interconnectedly, and that's just really hard. But I think that's what we go back to, we've all talked on today, is why we're all fortunately never going to be out of a day job, because that's the human element that we can all bring. Everything else, other things can be like automated, but actually embedding the way that business and tech has to work together is a human need, right? That needs our minds, our brains, our translation, our communication, our collaboration. And so that I don't have a good answer apart from the fact that we're always going to be on this trade-off, and that's where we should be freeing ourselves up to say, actually, these don't have to be dichotomous. How do we get to a world where both things happen simultaneously?
This is a related question. So lots of businesses rather see tech data as, but basically they only care or shout or invest about it when it goes wrong, rather than underpinning growth and development. How do we change that mentality? Graham?
I think linked and building on that last point, it's the positioning of how tech is used. And I think that a lot of people think that the technology itself is the innovation, whereas the technology itself is not the innovation. The technology itself just enables the innovation. It's the combination of the outcome that's being trying to achieve be achieved by the technology that's been put in. So using technology as a key enabler to achieve the outcome that you want is the way that it should be viewed. And I think, going back to the sort of technology programs that I've been involved in, the transformation programs I've been involved in, they have done this exact shift of, okay, it's a tech-led transformation program. Hang on a second, we need to review this. No, it's now a business-led transformation program, and it kind of swings, right, between the two. And actually what you need is, to your point, is it's just a collaboration between, right? It's not one or the other. It has to be joined up together, and it's easy to say and not easy to do, but it has to be a collaborative effort of what we're trying to achieve, what technology can enable that, and what will the outcome of delivering that together do, using data to be able to track the performance of deploying that technology. So again, probably a wordy answer, but I do think that element of seeing it as an enabler, not the answer to the challenge is definitely key.
Well, again, just a comparison came up in my head while you were talking there. I remember talking to a dive supervisor who worked on the recovery of a sunken Russian nuclear submarine. And he was talking about his dive team. He says, all these guys can dive. I take that as a given. He says, it's what they can do while they're down there. That's what I'm interested in. So the technology wasn't of particular interest to him. It was the functionality at the end of it that was key. Ed, there's a question here saying, I've lost it. How did that go? Basically, I have lost it too. That's really annoying. basically it was from a chap called Murray who said that recent research has shown that cloud centres are actually producing as much CO2 as airlines. Therefore, how confident are you that the work that you're doing is actually sustainable?
Yeah, it's a very good point. Firstly, I'll say that cloud data centers are by far away the most efficient way of doing computing. So if we are going to do this type of computing, we're much better doing it in the cloud than all of our companies buying massive computers, all the resources involved in that, and using them nowhere near their full capacity. Yeah, it is something we're aware of. We run a little bit of code every now and then to see how much carbon we burn in data centers to run our organization. That goes into our carbon footprint that we do as a company. In practice, the heating and lighting and things of our office, our small office in Edinburgh, is considerably more than our cloud data CO2 emissions. So it's quite a small part of our footprint. And certainly if we wanted to cut our emissions as a company, we should probably do less traveling to conferences and traveling to clients in the tropics by air travel. That's definitely, as a company, by far and away our bigger component. But it is something worth considering, and some companies deal with much bigger data sets, much more complicated things than us, and maybe making sure you do experiments only on a small sample of your data if you don't need to. And yeah, if you have, I've heard of some companies, some data science teams having a budget that someone's given them for AWS and being very careful to use it each month or each year. Otherwise, if they use less, then the company might not renew that budget. Whereas, of course, the incentive should be to be efficient with your budget and only use what you need, both from a financial and a climate point of view. So it's something we're aware of, and we should all be aware of. We should encourage data centers to be as efficient as possible, and we should use them as little as we need to. But overall, I think the benefits, certainly of our company that we do, far exceed any of our few tons of emissions a year from the data centers.
And I suspect this question is right from the heart. Oh, actually, before I ask that question, I'm going to try one more time. Any questions from the floor? You chickens. Right. This is quite a nice one. When building a data team from scratch, who would be the key hires?
Oh, these questions this morning, everyone's on fire, right? So,
they're all anonymous too, with the exception of a couple.
I guess, firstly, even before you hire, I think you've got to really evaluate yourself as to why you're building, like what type of data team you're looking to actually address, like what type of business challenges do you have? So are those like, very simple to solve, like readily available kind of machine learning or problem sets out there, like churn propensity, personalization, clustering. These problems are kind of readily solvable, and that's going to kind of help you determine. So you might actually want to just start by doing some kind of consulting to determine what your biggest business challenges are and how they actually map to like a data solution. And then you might actually find out that you have a really like research focused, or you might have much more like in terms of commercial practice applications. So that one aside a second, I think then you need to do a really good evaluation of what your foundations look like in terms of your data capability. A lot of organizations had their fingers burnt. This is where this like 85% of machine learning projects fail from Gartner a few years ago came from, because a lot of organizations jumped on the kind of the AI, ML bandwagon in terms of, these huge numbers that this one data scientist can deliver in terms of value. And the reality is that, I've worked at organizations where we've still got data sat underneath somebody's desk on a server that you just think, I'm not going to mention anything more than that, but you got to think about, how is my data connected to each other? What are my pipelines in terms of how I consume organizational data? So that could be like finance, HR, people data, actually data about whatever your business does. So for example, FT tracking website information through to, actually how we collect information about B2B contracts or B2C consumers on the website, through to actually the data that we collect through our marketing campaigns and our efforts on social. There's a huge reams of information, and how does that actually coherently structure into a foundational level that then you can start to build some of those insights, or if you want to, predictive and prescriptive services on top. You're probably thinking, oh my gosh, that's a huge world. Maybe you only have a slither of that. If you're not at that point, definitely make sure that you go and start hiring a data platform-esque type team. So that's where you probably want to go and hire some data engineer type people. If you're already in a great foundation, then that's where you probably can start to look at what you might class as, again, your data analytical capability. You start with insights before you even build onto like machine learning. And then, so I see it as a kind of like this iceberg, kind of the data platform capability, then your BI, so business intelligence, management information, then your kind of analytical, and then data science is kind of at the end of that. Data science can't, machine learning, AI can't really do any of that without that foundation. And maybe you couple all of that together in what you class as your data science team, but that pyramid structure still will exist, even if you try and deny it by saying, I'm just going to hire a data scientist. All you're asking that data scientist to do is do that full funnel. So they're probably not being used. And that's why we've seen overinflation of salaries, because people have to be incredibly multi-skilled to do that the whole stack of the triangle. So I think it's the cultural thing, what you're actually asking of this data organization to output. And then in terms of kind of the people, it's thinking about that pyramid type structure.
I'm fairly certain that answer was so comprehensive it will have been of no use to our questioner at all. Right. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. Ed, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, hiring data scientists is difficult in general. There's a shortage in the UK. We're trying in the University of Edinburgh and others to produce more of them. But yeah, I think the first challenge is writing a decent job description and actually finding someone to fill that position. I hope, we're bringing a lot of people into the UK on visas, and I hope that is something the government makes easier. If they want to drive economic growth, that's something I would do. But yeah, in terms of hiring, it's exactly what Leanne said. It's all about making good quality data, first of all. So you have to do that before you can do any fancy machine learning. As space intelligence, a lot of the work we do is basically cleaning up satellite data, and we have some nice pipelines we've developed to make nice kind of homogeneous images where everything's lined up, so you're seeing the same scene, you're actually looking at the same place, and you've got rid of those clouds I talked about. Long before we do any fancy deep learning, machine learning stuff, that happens right at the end once your high quality inputs are there, and having a team that can do that, whatever your data science problem is the issue. Yeah, start with insights before you start building a model, for sure.
Graham?
But yeah, to echo what's been said, I think when hiring for any skilled role where you want to be able to extract insight to drive your business, I think it is understanding what it is you're trying to get out of it. And I loved your slides, Leanne, where you looked at what is required from a team and kind of changing the focus on the different skills that are required, because there's no longer just, as you say, a data analyst that is required. It is somebody that understands different elements of the business outcomes you're trying to achieve. So I think that part is spot on.
Excellent. Thank you very much for all your answers. Can I ask you to thank our three speakers one more time, please?